Welcome, and thank you for tuning into this panel on sustainability reporting standards. I'm Marianna Skylakaki, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Our goal is to try and cut through some of the alphabet soup of ESG frameworks and examine what's working, what isn't, and what might actually get us to sustainability reporting that is decision useful, globally coherent, and grounded in the outcomes that really matter. I'm delighted to be joined by a remarkable panel of experts, people who not only understand the reporting landscape, but have also played a very active role in shaping it. I'd like to welcome Robert Eccles, visiting professor of management practice at Said Business School, Kerstin Lopatta, professor of accounting, auditing, and sustainability at the University of Hamburg and vice chair of ECRAG, Caroline Rees, president and co-founder of Shift, Eelco van Enden, CEO of Accountancy Europe, and last but not least, Jennifer Motles, Chief Sustainability Officer at Philip Morris International. Now, our session will take place in two parts. We'll start by mapping the current state of sustainability reporting, its ambitions, its limitations, frictions that exist, and then we'll shift the gear and move on to solutions, especially those that are tied to the upcoming EU Omnibus Simplification Bill and the broader reform efforts currently underway. So there's plenty of ground to cover. Let's get started with round one, the current environment and challenges.
So, this is Bob Eccles again, and things happen with technology and the internet. Marianna was kind enough to agree to do this, and she got on and she was able to make her opening comments, and then the internet died for her. So what we're doing here to kind of make this as seamless as possible is kind of post the session. I'm going to fill in for Marianna, and she did a great job of organizing round one and round two and asking questions. So what I'm going to do is basically ask the questions that people heard from her. The recording wasn't good, but I'm going to ask the questions that people heard from Marianna. You'll hear their response, and then I'll ask, the next question again, and it will just kind of roll through it. And then after about a half an hour, it'll just be kind of an interaction between me and the rest of the panelists, and we should all be good. So hope you enjoy it. So the first question was actually directed at me. So let me ask myself a question, and I've written it down here to make sure that I've got exactly what Marianna asked me. She said, Bob, from your perspective, do current reporting regimes like the ISSB, ESRS, etc., effectively capture real-world outcomes rather than policy intentions? If not, what's missing? So that was the question from Marianna to me.
So it's a good question, Marianna. Nice to see you again after meeting at the Delphi Economic Forum and agreeing to moderate our panel. So I really appreciate it. Jenny and I had a great time with you. The question is an interesting one. Policy outcomes, really only FRAG and the ESRS and the CSRD are kind of policy oriented, right? Because that's a government, and the ISSB is basically a private sector standard setting organization. Outcomes, it's like outcomes for who? Is it for investors? Is it a broader group? That gets us into double materiality. But I think the simpler answer is this reminds me of a Chinese proverb, which may be real or may be apocryphal, that a couple of hundred of years after the French Revolution, somebody asked some Chinese premier minister, whoever he was, emperor, so what do you think of the French Revolution? And he said, it's too soon to tell, right? So they're 3,000 years. Marianna, you can relate to this. You're Greek. So I think it really is too soon to tell, right? ISSB has got two standards. We're looking to get adoption. You haven't had formal adoption in the biggest capital market in the world, which is the United States. We won't get into all of the political complications of the United States probably in this call. You mentioned the omnibus bill. That's kind of working its way through. Just today I got an email about the consultation going out for ESRS where they're looking to reduce the number of data points. So until we really get some broad implementation, and we don't even know how broad is, depending on what happens with the omnibus bill, over some period of time, I think it's really hard to judge what the impact of these standards are.
Then the question after me was to Kerstin Lopatta. The question for her was, as one of the architects behind the proposed simplification track, what exactly is the core ambition behind the omnibus reform, and how confident are you that we can accomplish it?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Marianna. Well, the omnibus reform was, from my perspective, primarily driven from the companies that more or less complained about the perceived reporting burden under the CSRD and consequently also under the ESRS. So the main point of criticism and at the same time the core ambition of the omnibus reform is to simplify the ESRS, and in particular by reducing the number of the data points and also by curbing the scope of the companies that are subject to reporting requirements under the CSRD. But with the current work we did, I'm quite confident that the simplification targets will be achieved. However, it is questionable from my perspective whether the information needs of stakeholders will really be fully met as a result of this simplification. But we started the public consultation today, and I hope that we will at least get some clarity on that point regarding the needs of the stakeholders.
Following Kerstin, the question was to Caroline Rees, and the question to her was, have we over-engineered sustainability reporting to the point where it mostly benefits the compliance industry? What would it take to bring it back to common sense, decision-useful information for companies and stakeholders?
Yeah, thanks so much, Marianna. Look, there's always a tension, I think, in play here, right? Companies don't have one monolithic take on what these standards imply for them. You can have one set of companies that say, look, don't put a straitjacket on us, give us room to tell our stories, be more principles based. And you'll get other companies saying, oh, please, just tell us more exactly what it is you want us to disclose, right? They're really quite different takes. And I think sometimes that is a reflection of maturity levels and comfort with reporting. I think the longer companies have been doing sustainability reporting, the more they're in the camp of let us tell our story. The more new they are, the more they're perhaps looking for just tell us what you want to need to know or what you need to know. But I think, look, there's a reality that, and I think Kerstin reflected this, the first set of the ESRS as they came out, almost certainly were too detailed, but I don't think that was the biggest issue, actually. I think more than that was issues that they were, in certain areas, confusingly drafted. There was the same thing said slightly differently in different places. The language wasn't always as clear as it should be. And I think that caused confusion and misinterpretation, duplication in what was disclosed. But I honestly think, and I don't want to be controversial here, that there was also an awful lot of over-engineering in the actual implementation of the standards. Some of that coming from new functions within companies getting engaged for the first time, some of that coming from advisory services from outside companies that highly over-engineered this into spreadsheet-based, data point by data point, tier by tier, issue by issue analysis. And I think that has created an awful lot of complexity in the implementation that actually didn't need to be there. And I think, as Kerstin has said, the draft revisions that have come out now, they reduce the number of data points. But I think, as or more importantly, they also have given more clarity on the flexibility companies have to have a more sensible materiality assessment process. Not that kind of tick box tier by tier over granular approach, given more flexibility to talk about their reality in their circumstances. And I hope that we will see real advantage from that as it gets implemented. And back to Bob's point, it's really going to take time. It's going to take time to see what the reality is. But I think we're also going to need to see a lot of learning by doing. And as companies start to see, and they already did in the first round, start to see what their peers have done and see better ways that they could go about it, I hope we'll see year on year improvements and refinements and increases in the maturity and sophistication of how the exercise is undertaken.
Following the question to Caroline, there was one for Eelco van der Enden. The question to him was, what are the biggest operational pain points you hear from companies attempting to translate reporting requirements into internal practice? Where does the theory to practice gap show up most clearly?
It's about capturing data It's about getting access to the information out of your global supply chains to indeed report and prepare something that makes sense and can be validated. A lot of the information that is required is new. A lot of information is not available within its own systems, but in systems of suppliers. And I think that fully appreciating the needs of businesses to be able to cope with this takes a bit more time. We as both accountants, auditors, but also regulators, get better insight and better understand the intricacies of managing global supply chains for large businesses that need to report under these new standards. Not only that, it also puts a new, let's call it, dimension upon the relationship between suppliers of larger business and the small, medium enterprises they are, because they need to also provide that information that is required under the standards, the so-called trickle-down effect. Now, how are you going to be sure, as reporting entity, that that information is indeed correct and that it can be validated? So basically, we are on a journey that needs to, explore and experience how this all will work out in the next couple of years. It is learning by doing, but it's exactly at what we've seen in 2002, 3, and 4 with the introduction of international accounting standards. So I am mildly optimistic that if regulators are prudent and start to interact more with business and auditors on the difficulties and intricacies of validating and capturing this data, everything will be all right.
And the final question to Jennifer Motles was, from the perspective of a large multinational like PMI, what have been the biggest hurdles in aligning with current sustainability reporting regulations?
What do I want to? I think that the first thing that I want to say is that there's no doubt that there is value in making non-financial reporting or sustainability disclosures mandatory. I think that is very clear. It allows companies to understand the importance to integrate non-financial considerations and other forms of capital, not just financial capital, into their understanding of value creation, which ultimately allows us to create or understand economic models differently. And that, for me, has incredible value. So I appreciate what the regulator is doing in different ways, in different places. Now, what are the challenges for companies? And of course, it depends the size of the company and the area in which they're operating. For a company like ours that is present in many places around the world, with a big footprint and, of course, an incredibly big and complex supply chain, data collection management and ensuring that the quality of the data is at a level of reporting is, of course, a big part of the hurdle. And then the other part of the hurdle is data harmonization in terms of responding to these different standards, frameworks, and regulations that are evolving all around the world. So we're talking about what's happening at the EU that is and has always been at the forefront when it comes to regulating and thinking about sustainability, but it's obviously not the only one. And being present in different places around the world, we need to take that into consideration. Putting systems in place to manage and treat data and treat different KPIs that by different standards, by different frameworks, by different regulation may be defined in different ways, similar ways, but not exactly the same, creates challenges because there's no standardization as such yet. That becomes a little paralyzing. And so I think that simplification is for sure welcomed when it comes to the EU regulation. I think that it's cutting complexity, it's improving usability. And I think that indeed, like all the other panelists are saying, by testing and trying, we're going to improve together.
Then in round one, I should have said, was about the current environment and challenges. Round two was about the omnibus simplification bill and beyond and solutions. The question to me was, How critical is the volume and granularity of data points in making sustainability reporting useful or overwhelming?
Well, it's kind of a trade-off, right? The more volume and the more granular data points, the least useful it's going to be. It's just like an overwhelming compliance burden on companies. Nobody's going to know what information is important. I think a key focus is like, what is the information? It goes back to what I said in the beginning, like, who is the information for? Right. I mean, the ISSB is quite clear. The information is for investors. It's going to be relevant to making investment decisions. With the CSRD, there's a broader remit because it's got the double materiality. Some investors care about impact materiality. Most don't, at least at this stage. So NGOs care about impact materiality. So it depends on audience. And I think we'll see what happens with the simplification that Kerstin was talking about. There's also a question of what is the data point in the first place. I've got a good friend named Beatrice Krona, who is with the Stockholm Resilience Center. So she's a scientist, she's a biologist, and she's very interested in biodiversity, reporting on biodiversity. It's very interesting, having a conversation with her and Richard Barker at the ISSB. Her view was that the information that was being, reported under ESRS, and she's talked to Kerstin as well, wasn't exactly the kind of information that was useful, even from a scientific point of view, if you're thinking about impact materiality. So I think when we get into the specific things that we're reporting on, I think we need to make sure that we've got the expertise. And some of this will be scientific expertise. It'll be subject matter expertise like Caroline brings for human rights. And I think it's a broad remit to expect a standard-setting organization. With financial standard setting, everybody's an accountant or they know about accounting. With sustainability reporting, it's a much broader remit. And so a question I have is, are we getting the relevant experts in, the subject matter experts that can opine on, is this really a useful data point or not, and for who? And hopefully some of that is going to happen, and Kerstin can talk about it more in terms of what's going on with the omnibus bill. But I think if we were focused more on, what is the minimal set of data points that we need and for whom? If we kind of started with a minimalist perspective and just added to that as it really made sense, we'd be better off than trying to basically boil the ocean, which is a lot of what I think has been going on.
The follow-up question to Kerstin Lopatta was, what specific changes would you propose to ensure that omnibus reform truly simplifies without weakening accountability?
Well, when considering the CSRD under the omnibus reform, I have to really critically question why the scope is now being narrowed to a threshold of 1,000 employees. I mean, they're discussing it, but that's the number that's in the room right now, which is retreating even further from the previous requirement of 500 employees that we had under the NFRD. And additionally, so from my perspective, for the first years, I would not have introduced an assurance requirement at all. So that companies could first familiarize themselves with the reporting processes, and I would have introduced that a little bit later. I do, however, consider the introduction of the value chain cap to be very sensible. So the development of sector-specific standards would also be meaningful, that have been cancelled already a couple of months ago. So ideally, these sector-specific standards could have been developed in collaboration with the ISSB. And for this, I would make selected topics, for example, from set 1 mandatory for certain sectors, let's say. But overall, I would try to reduce or keep the scope of the sector-specific standards very limited. But when it comes to accountability, in my view, and Caroline, you already mentioned some, I would say, more or less mistakes that we had in the standards in the first place. But another possibility would have been that we just run the ESRS for a couple of years and get empirical evidence. But unfortunately, we did not have the chance. So when it comes to the ESRS, I think we should eliminate the data points that incur a high burden for companies, but offer just limited informational value. And on the other side, it is, of course, important to retain those data points that may be burdensome but deliver significant value to all stakeholders. So since we have already reduced or simplified substantially the number of qualitative data points in the current version, I think it's crucial to ensure that companies are still able to communicate their sustainability story. I think, Caroline, you have also been referring to that, and do not lapse into just compliance exercise.
And in our usual sequence, the next question to Caroline Rees: what's the most practical way to reconcile technical robustness with the need to drastically reduce the compliance burden for SMEs and midcaps, especially those indirectly captured via value chain pressure?
Yeah, well, I mean, as we've said, the revised version of the ESRS already does drastically reduce the amount and the complexity of the reporting being expected. And to Kerstin's very good point, I mean, I also would sort of argue that having done that, right, having reduced by 60% or so the number of data points, including complexity thereof, one could tenably increase the scope of the companies now covered by that back to a more sensible level. And I'll come back to that point perhaps. But I do also agree that we absolutely do and did need to move away from larger companies sending out blanket surveys to small companies of numerous asks that honestly were just about passing off risk to their suppliers, that were just about saying, you tell us there are no problems, and then we can say there are no problems and we don't have to think about it, right? That's serving nobody. It's unfair to the smaller suppliers. It's not what should be expected of the larger companies and their own due diligence. The omnibus, of course, as a package, was supposed to help with this, right? And in a number of ways, one of which was this idea of a value chain cap. And I don't think there's a problem per se with the concept of a value chain cap. It was there already in the first set of standards. But what I do worry about is that the Commission proposal, in the way they've introduced this, supposedly to ease that trickle-down effect on smaller companies, is actually going to end up compounding the problem if it's not changed. What do I mean by that? Well, what we're going to be seeing is that the push down on what companies can ask of their smaller suppliers is going to constrain their ability to get information they actually need, because the value chain cap is now tied to a standard that was devised for very different purposes, what was called the voluntary SME standard. And the content of that is really very, very de minimis information that has no relationship to materiality, zero, no mention of materiality within it. What we're going to see as a result, if that's applied, is actually that people are going to work around it because it doesn't actually meet the need. So we're going to see larger companies will increase their use of third parties to ask questions to which they need answers for commercial risk management reasons. They already use third-party suppliers. They're not covered and limited by any value chain cap or what they can ask. And they'll start to ask those questions of smaller suppliers. And investors will ask those questions of the smaller listed companies that are out of scope of the CSRD, because they need that information too. So by over-constraining through the CSRD what companies can reasonably ask of smaller suppliers, we will actually find a proliferation of workarounds, and SMEs will face multiple asks from multiple folks. There are some more sensible propositions coming through as to how to calibrate that in a more sensible way, right? And what this needs to be is about the ability to ask targeted questions of specific partners where there is a clear reason to believe that there is a legitimate issue, right? That's a risk-based approach. That's not blanketing with surveys of the same questions of everybody regardless of sector. It's targeted. And I think SMEs can perfectly well manage that. I know many that we've talked with grasp that. And indeed, in some ways, answering those questions become easier for smaller companies because they don't have the huge workforce, the multiple jurisdictions, the complex value chains. And honestly, even an SME should be able to answer a question about how they manage or avoid child labour or forced labour, right? Or displacement of indigenous peoples, where those are live issues for their business, right? That's not about a burden of compliance. That's a legitimate and reasonable set of information to have, and it should be core to their own risk management. So it's about calibrating, right? Yes, let's get away from silly ideas such as just do due diligence on your first tier partners. Don't ask small companies any significant questions. Let's focus on and let's get towards approaches that are about targeted questions, relevant questions on live issues for those smaller companies where there are legitimate concern. And then we will avoid setting up or motivating parallel systems to get around what the CSRD is trying to do.
On to Eelco van der Enden. How can the EU ensure genuine interoperability between ESRS and global standards like ISSB, particularly for cross-border companies facing diverging disclosure demands?
Okay, well, first then we assume that the ISSB is now a global standard, which would mean that it has been implemented like everywhere, which it hasn't. So the good news for that is that there is still time and room for maneuver to make sure there is alignment to indeed start to build a global baseline. How can you do that? Well, by working more closely together and making sure that the objectives you have are synchronized. The word interoperability, I don't like. No one can explain to me what interoperability really means. If we look at 74 jurisdictions that go their own way, what we have seen in this Compromis de Sevilla, where they're basically allowed between brackets to tailor-make any standards into something that fits local purpose needs or whatever. If you have 64, 74 jurisdictions that deviate from the original core, and you say these are the data points or the mapping points where we deviate, and you call that interoperability, you have 74 different systems you need to report on. And if one is changing, then everything needs to be redesigned within the reporting entity systems in order to make it work. So interoperability sounds nice, it isn't. If you want to build a global baseline, it's about alignment and equivalence. And I think in the end, you should look more at equivalence. And that means that you must be prepared as regulators to accept that standard setters need to work very closely together in order to come to a common understanding to indeed get one set of standards. Looking at the international accounting standards of the IFRS, that was achieved to a big extent, not completely. Looking at the current landscape, Euro and ISSB, it deteriorated a bit into a race to the bottom. How many data points do you have? Well, I have, then I will go lower. That is, I don't think, what the real objective of this whole exercise is. And I think we should go first back to why we are doing this. We are doing this because we want to provide investors with a certain set of information so then they can make decisions based on facts, and other parts of society that are worried on pollution, environmental and social issues that they want to have a bit more insight in. If we know and we call these two aspects double materiality, then why is it so difficult to cooperate and come to one single global baseline? It is about political will and courage to bite the bullet and get to one set of governance, as far as I'm concerned, or one global standard setter that will be accepted by the majority of jurisdictions in the most simple way, easy to comply at low cost, showing visible value add. It needs political courage. It needs people standing outside, that's not English, but outside their egos, if you know what I mean. And it needs a common objective. And I think the common objective of corporate reporting, both for investors as well as society, has so much linked points that it can't be too difficult to reset and do it again before all types of jurisdictions and regions start to implement derivatives of the originals that were set either by the ISSB or Europe.
And then once again, the final question was to Jennifer Motles. What is important for sustainability reporting moving forward? Where are the opportunities?
I love it. No, I want to say two things in relation to what Eelco was saying. First, I totally agree on equivalence and the value of that. That's a little bit what I was trying to mention in a more tangible or empirical way in terms of the challenges that companies face trying to respond in good faith. I feel that, PMI, and I feel very privileged leading the efforts of sustainability and on sustainability disclosure because we have the resources and the sophistication. We have been doing integrated reporting for many, many years now. We have done double materiality before it became mandatory, which means that we have the knowledge, we have the expertise, and we understand what's the value of doing it, which allowed us or put us in a place of privilege when this became mandatory. And even so, it's still a very complicated exercise. And it's complicated because while we need to comply with what CSRD is asking, we also need to comply with what Indonesia is asking, with what the California rules are asking, and it's really not one-to-one. And so if I want to build a system, and this is really what we have built, a system that is able to process and treat non-financial data the same way that you treat financial data, with the same rigor, with the same controls, with the same robustness. So that is data that is reliable, that is for decision-making purposes, that is useful for external stakeholders, that is comparable. How many sets of KPIs that are measuring more or less the same thing but have different definitions can I have in one same system? It's a challenge. And it's a challenge that a company like mine can afford, let's say, for a while. But how many companies can afford it? And so it becomes difficult, even in good faith, to comply when you don't have that clarity. And that is for companies that are already advanced. But for companies that are genuinely starting and are seeking guidance besides and beyond an understanding on their obligations, but generally a guidance on how to define what they need to do and what they need to report, it's also very confusing. So I totally agree with those 2 points. And I wanted to add the value of comparability, which for me is very powerful. I think that the question that was coming for me was, what is important about sustainability reporting moving forward? And I said it before, I think that there is incredible power in making the exercise mandatory without a doubt. I think that data is power, and data that is of good quality can allow you to understand trends, can allow you to do forecasting, can allow you to understand the impact of your interventions. And so in a very beautiful way, you don't need to choose between impact materiality and financial materiality. You start to understand how both of them come together. And you, as I said before, understand value creation in a different way. But for that, there really needs to be very clear guidance and consensus and a consensual understanding among all parts in terms of standardization and equivalence in terms of how companies can and should report. But I think we're on the way to that, or I'm hopeful.
So it's nice that you're hopeful, Jenny, because when Eelco was talking, man, like I was having a flashback, and it wasn't a flashback from the 60s when I was in college. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, 74 jurisdictions. It wasn't that long ago, as you said, we had Country Gap. Then we got to IFRS. Then there was the Norwalk Agreement. My good friend Bob Hers, who was the chairman of FASB, we were going to sort of get reconciled global financial accounting standards, which didn't happen. You know, we have to have U.S. exceptionalism. We're kind of playing this same thing out again, right? We've got ESRS, we've got ISSB, we go back SASB, there was GRI. Now it's kind of gone from NGOs over into regulatory and kind of quasi-regulatory organizations. So let me ask you this, and we're going to start with you, Eelco, because you talked about political will. Man, I'm sitting here in the United States. I don't have a dog in the hunt. You know, people are rattling around over there in Brussels and Frankfurt and London, and they're doing whatever, and I'm just enjoying the Trump administration. I've got enough to entertain me that I can barely keep track of what you people are doing in sustainability reporting standards. So let me ask you this. And let's be really specific. What is the message? If we could give a message to Emmanuel Faber, right, at the ISSB, and forget Patrick because, he's going to be, out of a job in a couple of months. Person that's got to sit on top of this thing and make the overall call, is DG FISMA, Maria Louise Albuquerque. What would you want to tell these people? Because they're really the ones where I think the political will needs to be exercised. What would be the message to them to get us in the place that we all want to be? What would you tell them, Eelco?
Sit together, have a drink, and have a good discussion on how a governance structure could be developed that works. Start there. Start with a personal relationship. Start building trust between the organizations to make sure that it goes beyond technical discussions, but a joint objective for a global baseline. That's what I would say.
And you and I have talked a little bit about, kind of at a high level, what a governance structure might look like. And we're not going to design it here, obviously, but what do you think some of the principles would be for a governance structure? And I agree we need to build these personal relationships first, but what would be some of the principal building blocks of a governance structure to accomplish what we want?
An important issue is, of course, that European Parliament and Commission have the prerogative for legislation. They cannot basically outsource that. So you have to think how you build a system that makes sure that that prerogative is safeguarded. It has to do with then oversight on the working processes indeed to come to a baseline or to come to equivalence. I think it has to do with far more aligning, and I mean really aligning the operational work of the teams that design these type of standards. I think it's also very important to make absolutely sure that what the objective of the standard setting is. We don't want to go into the mess the international corporate tax landscape is. And we all know what it is. Each and every jurisdiction have its own thing, and they use taxation to collect revenue, to influence behavior, and to redistribute wealth. Well, if you try with one tool to solve three issues, you have a problem. And I'm afraid that many jurisdictions have to make a choice what for sustainability reporting and corporate reporting is. Is it purely for accountability? Is it to provide society insight? Is it for investors' decisions? So make absolutely sure that you know what your target group is and what the needs of your target group really is. The whole discussion we had about granularity. Difficult word for a Dutch guy. Did we really think that NGO society were waiting for 2,200 data points in a 400 pages report? Did we really think investors were looking at that? So first think market. What does the market want? And then not only the investors, but of course also the other users of that information. What is reasonable? If you know what's reasonable for those parties, you can come to a joint understanding on how to construct a infrastructure around setting those standards, whereby you please next time UN do not push countries to do it all on their own way, because that is counterproductive for investments in communities, but make sure that this aligned equivalence-based approach is moving forward. So sit together, have a drink, think of a structure based on trust and cooperation, and then start from there rethinking, why are we doing this? What are the basic needs for investors and the other stakeholders? And then roll it out. I think if you have ISSB and EU joining forces in a cooperative model, it would be such a bloody strong signal to the rest of the world that I'm pretty sure that that will become the global baseline.
So I'm going to get other views, but Eelco, I don't want to put words in your mouth. But let me just say, when you say have a drink, since you're European, you probably mean share a glass of wine. As an American, it means we're going to get together and have a beer. guys, we're going to just have a beer, but you guys are sophisticated, so you'd probably do it with wine, right? Over there?
Well,
in Brussels?
since you have now high tariffs on our French wines and champagnes, we have a lot of stuff here, so the prices will go down. So we have to do something to support our farmers.
What other views do people have? I mean, I think we want to get to a global baseline, political will, relationships. Anybody else want to jump in here? Suggestions on kind of how we get to where we all want to be?
Yeah, maybe I take a small step here. So I completely agree with what Eelco said. What I also would add to the maybe governance structure is, and I think we underestimated that in the first set, and after we delivered the first set, Eelco, is education in all the areas. But I think that's what you mentioned with not every member state is doing his own view on it. And I think I would like to add that. So education on how to prepare them. Caroline, you said, it was not concise enough, or we also had auditors, having different views. I think that would be something I would like to add. And also a point Jennifer made. I think we should think of how to come closer to the financial reporting part also. So we have, at IFRAC, we have SRB and FRB. We talk with each other, but same as for the ISSB and the financial reporting over there. So we have a lot of things. Jennifer, you referred to that, especially. I know we discussed a lot the anticipated financial effects, and when I'm referring to that, I think a lot can be also learned from financial reporting and can be exchanged. But that is what Eelco already said. Coming closer, get trust. And that would be my 2 cents on that question, Bob.
Caroline, Jenny, you want to jump in here on anything?
Yeah, sure. A couple of thoughts. I mean, what's crystallizing there, right? It's got to be meaningful, valuable information, and it's got to be viable as well to prepare. And I think, Eelco captured some of the issues that can get in the way of viability. There's a piece about I think bridging. It comes to having a drink and sitting down together as well, but bridging disciplines, right? It all comes back to a good glass of wine. But you've got so much rigor in the traditional accountancy profession, right? And there's a lot to be learned from that. We've then got the folks on the climate and science side, where there's a lot of science and there's a lot of data and there's a lot of measurement and there's a lot of methodology. And then we've got the social side, which is, I think, the least well understood, the least well represented in most of these processes, where you often have social science. It's a different beast, but you also have actually a higher value of qualitative information, a lot of thought from a social science perspective about what makes that valuable. And we can translate assumptions from one of these domains onto the others. Like quantitative information is always more valuable than qualitative, right? That's, I think, it's not always a truism, right? What is the value of qualitative information? What makes it valuable? And what does an assurance provider then do if it's not as readily verifiable as a quantitative equivalent? So I think there's some learning to do around that. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to need to happen over time as we work out what is both meaningful and viable information to arrive at. I also think there's a lot of opportunity here in that double materiality line and in the understanding of what's to be gained from the connectivity between the two. Because I think historically, if I go back a while, we had GRI about impact, and we had other things that were about financial materiality, even pre-ISSB had SASB and so forth. And really, with different disciplines, there was different parts of companies that would look at them. It was as if the two completely different methodologies, ne'er the twain shall meet, different people with different skills thinking they have nothing to do with each other. And I think what we are seeing more with double materiality, and what we're seeing in companies' actual reporting, is that it's a much more coherent through line from these two things. And that actually, and we've seen that a lot in our work over the last 15, 20 years with companies, when companies simply went straight for what they assumed was business risk, they missed sustainability related business risks because of assumption sets that were endemic to the history of looking at business risk. And it's only when they started to open up and say, let's really understand where the impacts are, that it started to turn on light bulbs about a whole host of business risks that needed to also sit on that side of the picture. And I think there's tremendous opportunity actually about better understanding that connectivity. We analysed a bunch of reports, about 40 reports from more mature reporters on the social side. Every single financially material thing they reported a related material impact, right? Super interesting as to how they're seeing the connectivity there. And I think, again, in terms of coming together around baselines and common approaches and so forth, there's a lot to be gained from what we're seeing about the relationship between these two facets of what can be material.
Let me ask Jenny a question, because we've been talking at the level of the standard setters in companies and countries and stuff. But the way this gets implemented in companies comes down to individual companies. And Jenny, you were talking about we need this information to have the same quality, reliability as financial information. And you report to the CFO. So I guess two questions. Number one, you reporting into the CFO and kind of seeing how the systems are being put in place, is that enabling you to kind of see more clearly the things that Caroline was talking about and you were referring to earlier and Kerstin brought up about the relationship between sustainability performance and financial performance, which I think is key? And then the second question is, if you could wave a magic wand, this is your magic wand moment, and say in every company in the world that's adopting sustainability reporting standards, they should report to the CFO. And if you could pick one thing that would make sure of the quality and the relevance, it would be having the CSO report to the CFO. But let's start with you personally at PMI. What have you learned from this?
I didn't understand the second question. Was it a yes or no question?
No, the second question, if you can wave a magic wand and you could make every CSO report to the CFO, do you think that would be a game changer in terms of what we were talking about earlier, the quality, the relevance, the value that we're getting out of sustainability reporting and how companies are presenting it to the world?
I think so. I'm obviously a big advocate of the sustainability function reporting to the CFO. I'm biased, I guess. But there is no doubt, and I've been reporting to the CFO since before the wave of mandatory disclosures kicked in. So since 2020, right around COVID time. But it is undeniable that there's so many synergies that can be created with the finance function, especially in relation to what Caroline was just saying. That connectivity of that double materiality and the understanding of assessing risk besides and beyond financial risk. You know, there's so many tools that we have in place, especially on the qualitative side. Think about human rights impact assessments that are assessing human rights related risks in your supply chain that can very beautifully be integrated into your ERM, into your enterprise risk management practices. Think about CCRO that was introduced by TCFD, the climate change risk and opportunity assessment that can also be very nicely integrated into enterprise risk management. And when you start essentially stretching systems that run companies to insert non-financial performance and non-financial considerations, then you really start building strategy in a different way. So it's not just about the output of how risks, opportunities, impacts are being assessed. It's not just about the output of the data and the quality of the data that is being disclosed and reported, but it's really about the input that is allowing you to drive strategy and think about success in the long term, in a longer term horizon, that what markets are so perversely making companies to do, to report quarterly, right? When you think about sustainability, sustainability is by nature very much long term, and very much of the investments that are being made are investments that are long term. And so this is very nice when you manage to integrate it fully. Listen, I think that when companies are starting from scratch, let's say, to think about sustainability, to think about environmental and social considerations, building that governance around it, to change the mindset of an organization and understand success in a way that is respectful of environmental and social boundaries, it is very useful to take advantage of the systems and the skeleton that companies have already in place to monitor financial performance and report financial performance, because many of those disciplines can be extrapolated into non-financials in terms of controls, in terms of auditing, in terms of risk management, in terms of assessing value, and eventually in an integrated way understand performance differently. So I think that there is a lot of value in reporting to the CFO. Absolutely.
So we've got a little bit of time left. So let me ask you all one last question, and you can kind of pick it up in different ways. Standard setting is always a complicated process. You look at the history of financial accounting reporting. Standards are changing all the time, what they do with goodwill and depreciation and derivatives and this and that. I mean, it's like never done. Okay, so I think we need to be realistic about that. But that's fine. What does good look like in 5 years? 5 years from now, if kind of reasonable good, not our best hopes, but not our worst fears, what would be a reasonable expectation for what good looks like 5 years from now in terms of standards, equivalents, how they're being used, how relevant they are, what investors are doing with them? We've identified the right data points. We are to connect the sustainability and the financial performance together. For each of you, kind of what does good look like? And Kerstin, we'll start with you just because you're in the top left-hand box on my computer.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question, Bob.
That's the reason.
Okay, that's the only reason. Okay, good.
It's the only reason.
What does good look like? Well, first of
Well, no, and you're a professor. You're a professor, so I like you.
Thanks.
You're a professor, and I'm a professor. I like you, so you get to go first. You're the professor.
So your question is, what does good look like? So coming from the more granular perspective, good would be, and I'm referring to what Eelco and Jennifer and also Caroline already said, so that everybody understands how to do the materiality analysis proper and how to report based on the materiality analysis. Good would also be for me if the standards we already have for consultation, and that will be hopefully get into a delegated act next year, that we will have them still in 5 years, and that they will not change again in about 1 or 2 years, and that we have empirical evidence that we can, draw some conclusions from that. And good would also be if companies steer their business, and that's what Jennifer also was referring to, right? If they steer their business with the reporting qualitative and quantitative data, I would say. So maybe I hand on, Bob. These are three good things, I think.
Those are good. So here's what we're going to do. So Caroline, you're in the top right-hand box, but that's not the reason. You're living in America like I am. And you have a British accent, and you went to Oxford, but you become an American citizen. So you get to go next.
So many reasons. So I start by concurring on good double materiality assessment on a risk-based approach. And I'll add to that, and it'll bring us back to EU legislation, that is thoroughly aligned with due diligence, right? We don't have the lawyers going off and developing systems with advisors on how to do due diligence, just as the CFO goes off and devises double materiality approaches. The approach in due diligence is risk-based analysis of where are the greatest risks, where are the greatest impacts on people and planet. That is the same as your impact materiality assessment process, which then feeds into your financial. One system across the organization, effective and efficient. That's number one. Two, we will not be getting a lot of boilerplate language, right? That companies will be telling us what is actual in the reporting year, not a generic process. Here's what we did this year. Here's how it played out this year. Here's what changed this year, right? So real-time information, not lots of boilerplate. That will include talking about the progress and the setbacks, because it's not real if it doesn't involve both, and that investors will have the maturity and sophistication to know that companies talking about setbacks is a good thing, because these are the organizations on top of the issues and managing them well. And that we'll also be hearing more about, and where are we going next, that future looking information, again, with markets capable of understanding that and interpreting that and understanding that those kinds of disclosures are a sign of sophistication and what they should be looking for, and markets are able to give credit for what is then actually more a signal of corporate culture of really grasping sustainability issues.
Great. Eelco, you're European, you're in a tie, you're dressed up, man. Ties are out. You guys haven't got that yet. But out of respect, Eelco, you can go next.
Yeah, we're very old-fashioned, aren't we? No, it's we must learn to accept that perfect does not exist, that things keep developing and keep going in motion. So in 5 years' time, we will be still working towards a global baseline based on double materiality, whereby the intricacies of the operational effects of reporting and auditing them are being taken into consideration, and whereby we will be developing a system that is continuously improving themselves. We see in the environmental space, things are changing fast that need different information, different reporting. We see geopolitical changes that bear risk, that need attention and need new ways of working, and so forth and so forth. We must stop thinking that a set of standards is a frozen object in time that is fit for the future. It isn't. It is dynamic. We must accept dynamism, but we must make sure that we align as jurisdictions as much as we can. And we must teach, to Kerstin's part, what I call the regulatory supply chain, making regulators understand that when they develop and design something, that it has a huge effect on operations and businesses and society. So take more into account that when you start with the report, with the standardization project, take account of what it means for reporters and assessors of that information. Always begin with the end in mind. And if regulators start to do that, then I'm a happy man.
We don't have time, Eelco. Remind me, when you say reporters, this reminds me of why the U.S. Marines think civilians exist, but we'll leave that for another webinar. But there's a direct analogy between why U.S. Marines think civilians exist and the way you accountants talk about companies as reporters. But we'll just leave that for the accountants in the audience to try to figure out. And I'm going to go to Jenny last on purpose, because Jenny's at the coalface, right? So she's the person that's dealing with implementing these standards, using these standards, communicating these standards to the board, to the senior management team, to the investors. So Jenny, what does good look like for you?
I have a controversial answer. It's controversial because it goes on a tangent, but it returns. In 5 years, there's no more ESG ratings, because the disclosure and the quality of the data disclosed and the engagement of companies with different stakeholders, including investors, is of high quality and it's reliable. You can go to the source, assess by yourself, data is comparable, KPIs are the same. Why do you need 700 ESG ratings with opaque methodologies, with weird materialities that assess in their own secret sauce what is good and what is not good, when you have companies that are putting data that is assured and is of high quality and is comparable out there? In 5 years, there's some more ESG ratings. I can have my team do meaningful work and create impactful change that is positive everywhere, instead of sitting in a desk filling 1 million surveys so that people can decide in their own arbitrary decision what is good, even if it's not even material for our company. It's controversial, but it's true. That's my dream in 5 years.
That's intriguing to me, because basically the reason, in my view, that ESG ratings exist is that they were a proxy for the lack of reporting, sustainability reporting according to standards. And so
that's why I say I want a tangible return, because once it becomes mandatory, once it's effective, once the data is out there and it's reliable and it's high quality and it's comparable and engaging is high, and you can go to the source and all the data is there on my website for free with trends and forecasts and analyses, why do you have to go to an ESG rating that decides by themselves what is good and bad with a materiality that is completely disconnected with an exercise that I conducted in-house and that is subject also to assurance, by the way, the process and the results? Do you need it? Do you need an ESG rating? No, in 5 years. That's my wish.
I think it's a great wish. So we should probably wrap this up. I'm the oldest person on this panel by a lot, and I'm the strongest person on this panel by a lot, as you all know. So I'm going to give myself the last word. And here's what it is. I found this a fascinating discussion, and I was thinking about two things throughout the entire conversation. One is, where does the U.S. stand on this? I mentioned that earlier. We'll never have any regulation that requires U.S. companies to report according to anything. We don't even have a climate disclosure rule anymore. I'm actually quite optimistic about what's going to happen with U.S. companies. They get the importance to investors who are in global markets. You know, the largest asset managers in the world are based in the U.S. and they want these data. I think the more interesting thing that's on my mind, and you may agree or disagree with, but as all of you know, I've been spending the last, 3, 4, 5 years making friends with Republicans. My ESG outreach campaign, I'm making friends with Republicans all over America. We talk about these things. I mean, I'm not hanging with the MAGA crowd. Like, I'll admit that, right? I'm not hanging out with Jim Jordan and folks like that, Pete Hegseth. But the Republicans I know, if they were listening to this conversation, risk, enterprise risk management, integration with financial consequences, what's really material, what's important, not a lot of data that's not necessary, they would be absolutely comfortable with this. What they wouldn't be comfortable with is that there's laws that say you're going to have to do it, and that they'd be uncomfortable with, U.S. companies being subject to extraterritoriality, even though we do that to other people. But conceptually, what I like about this is that it's very much a market-based conversation based on risk, based on materiality. And I think the challenge, in Europe is how we sort of get to equivalence. The challenge in America is kind of how we talk about this in a slightly different way, but basically to accomplish the same ends. And about that, I'm pretty optimistic. And so 5 years from now, what I'd like to see is that sustainability reporting has gone beyond being a political discussion, and it's really a capital market importance to society discussion, and I think we can get there. And with that, I guess we'll wrap it up. So over to you, Peter and Lori.